our COVID-19 financial response technical assistance call. We are delighted to put this technical assistance call together for you. We encourage you to ask as many questions as possible. Please use the chat feature if you're technologically inclined to do so, and if not, just simply shout out and we'll go ahead and answer those responses. Michael Arbola, Deputy Chief Financial Officer. We have many members of my team and staff on this call to assist that are experts in each of their fields, as well as our lovely Guidehouse team that's always awesome. And so please do feel free to ask those questions and take it away, Guidehouse.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I'm Natalie. I'm one of the Guidehouse team members, and we've been working with the county for the last year over the CARES Act, helping get that distributed. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the interim report for the ARPA funding that many of you have received, and we'll talk through who's responsible for filling out this interim report. And there are project and expenditure reports coming due for some of our non-entitlement units at the end of October. But today we're really going to be focusing on the interim report. We'll have additional webinars focusing on the project and expenditure report at a later time. So we're going to walk a little bit through the background of ARPA. We're going to talk through those reporting requirements, and then again, really focus on the interim report. Like I mentioned, the interim report is going to be for our metro cities, so that's under 250,000 in population, and having received over 5 million in their total allocation of fiscal recovery funds. So this does not apply to you. You do not have an interim report due at the end of August. You will have an annual project and expenditure report due at the end of October. And like I said, these reporting requirements they'll be complementary, but there is not an interim report requirement for our non-entitlement units. The middle block you see is the recovery plan performance report. The county and the city of Chicago are responsible for completing that report, but neither our metro cities nor our non-entitlement units are required to fill that out. So we will not be covering any of the information on that today. I'm walking through, just kind of familiarizing ourselves. Once again, we are talking through the local fiscal recovery fund, one of the many buckets of money that was issued by the federal government in March under the American Rescue Plan Act. So we're really focusing on that little bucket. There are likely other reporting requirements for the other buckets, and we will not be focusing on those today. So we'll be talking through how we can spend that money just briefly, and then what we want to do once we've spent it in an eligible way, and how we tell the government how we've spent it. We do have those 6, hopefully getting more and more familiar, broad eligibility categories. I'm supporting the public health response. That includes anything from vaccination fees or incentives to medical expenses to cover any ICU kind of overloads that we're seeing at hospitals with the new variants coming out. We're also allowed to spend on addressing any negative economic impacts. So that's going to really address the needs in our communities for our small businesses, our restaurants, any of those kind of additional needs that we felt when the pandemic shut everything down last year, and kind of regrouping and revitalizing our communities that way. And premium pay for essential workers, again, is very similar to hazard pay as it was in the CARES Act, except it's going to be for those workers who are not able to work at any portion or a portion of their job remotely. So no telework allowed to qualify for the premium pay. And that's going to be on a case municipality by municipality distinction on who is considered an eligible essential employee to receive those premium pay bonuses and increases. Next, we'll talk through tomorrow in the webinar, the revenue loss calculation, really just looking at calculating what could have been our revenue in 2020 versus what actually was our revenue in 2020, and then what can we spend that on? What is a government service? How do we go about calculating that? What's the actual, we'll walk through an example, but we do have a webinar on that calculation tomorrow. And then the last 2 buckets, water and sewer infrastructure, as well as broadband infrastructure, are really addressing the needs of the strain that we felt on the infrastructure last year with everyone working remote when things were shut down. And it's really the government kind of acknowledging that there are different needs outside of the just kind of addressing the pandemic, but also there's some needs to build up our infrastructure. And we know there's another infrastructure bill in the House right now that will be a separate set of eligibility requirements from these. So these are looking at getting clean water to our communities, as well as increasing our internet specifically for broadband. We'll talk through a little bit just what we can't use this money for, so you won't see in expenditure categories for any related expenses for these. So no rainy day funds. We aren't allowed to pay directly into our pensions. We can't pay down any debt as with most federal grants. Paying down debt is not allowed. It's not to be used as a match for any of the federal matching grants. So if you have a cost share or a matching program, and it says you're not allowed to use federal money, this is not allowed to be used for that cost share. And then that middle bucket of general infrastructure spending, we'll talk through tomorrow how general infrastructure can be covered through the revenue loss calculation, but as a direct cost underneath the ARPA FRF fund eligibility requirements, you cannot spend on general infrastructure. You can spend on those water and sewer infrastructure and broadband infrastructure, but not our general infrastructure costs. So just a brief kind of regrouping on what we're talking through when we have these eligibility categories and these expenditure categories. You notice that they are very similar to the 6 eligible categories that we just talked through previously. So what we want to do is talk through what reporting. Federal government always, when they give you money, they want to know how it's been spent. They want to know what you're doing with it. In this case, the Treasury is also asking what you intend to do with it in some situations. So there are 3 major reports, and you'll notice this is the same 3 breakouts that we had on the prior slide of who's responsible for which, and we'll touch back on that in a minute. We'll be focusing today on the interim report. That's going to be for our metro cities. It's a one-time report reporting all of the expenditures and obligations we've had since March 3rd, 2021 through July 31st, 2021. So if you are a metro city, you haven't spent any money, those are all going to be zeros. It'll be a very easy report. We'll have some additional data points to enter with our revenue loss calculation. If you intend or plan to use any of that revenue loss, we'll need to enter those data points. Otherwise, it would be a very quick and easy interim report. The middle category, again, that recovery plan is only applicable to the county and to the city. And so we won't be covering any of the data points on that. It's going to be a report that will be published on the county's website for everyone to look at once we're done. And then lastly, that project and expenditure report. This is going to be a quarterly report for the metro cities going forward, as well as the county and the city. However, it will be an annual report for all of our non-entitlement units. So we'll talk through a little bit of the reporting schedule. There was a guidance that was issued yesterday and that we're still combing through to make sure that we have all of the relevant data points, but we've captured a lot of it here, including some screenshots. But the Treasury Department is still issuing guidance and reporting requirements as we go. It is August 11th, and the first report's due in 20 days. So we do understand that time is of the essence to get these things kind of out. Wanted to cover again who's responsible for which reports and when. Same slide as before. Interim report will be for the county and for metro cities receiving more than $5 million in fiscal recovery money, as well as less than 250,000 in population. That interim report is a one-time report due at the end of the month. The recovery plan is not applicable to our municipalities, only to the county. And then the project and expenditure report we'll touch on briefly. Some of the reporting characteristics we'll cover here will also be applicable to that report, but we'll have additional reporting webinars in the coming weeks, especially closer to that October 31st deadline, to really drive in, talk through what needs to happen at the project level and at the expenditure level to report appropriately to Treasury. Treasury has issued a bit of guidance. There's not only the user guide submitted or issued yesterday, there was also a reporting compliance guide. Links for both of those will be at the end of this webinar. The slides for this webinar will be posted to the county website. But really, the guidance and the user guide are talking through how Treasury would like to see the expenditures reported. And what they're saying is there's these expenditure categories that we, the Treasury, have given you. There are 66 subcategories, and each of your projects, as you define them, needs to align as best they can to a single expenditure category. You can have multiple projects under an expenditure category, but one project is to do your best not to have one project spanning 2 expenditure categories. And what that allows us to do is really go through and track the obligations per a single expenditure category, so we're not muddying our waters. The guidance issued yesterday did say that administrative costs for each of these projects would fall under the same expenditure category and not under the admin cost category, which is a good clarification. I think a lot of us were talking through splitting up those admin costs and reporting them separately. Treasury did explicitly say that those admin costs would fall under the expenditure category. For example, if you have a small business program, you would code all of your expenses, not only the small business grants, if that's how the program is set up, you'd also, if you hired a program administrator to administer those small business grants, those would also be under that small business grant Treasury expenditure category. You would not split out the program administrator's costs into an administrative cost bucket. So we are going to look at obligations and expenditures, and a couple things to think through as you're developing your strategy in terms of how we want to spend the money. What are your internal controls? How are your reporting structures set up? Knowing now what we have to report on, and there are some additional expenditure categories that require performance metrics. How are you going to be able to capture these? How are you tracking your projects? Are you going to use your reports straight from your GL? Are you going to have an Excel spreadsheet on the side that tracks all of your expenditures and your obligations for your many partners? Just some things, we left these reporting tips, just things to think through as you're developing your internal structures and your internal controls on how to track and monitor and report on these expenditures that we have. Again, if you want to have a subrecipient monitoring process, they will fall under the same categories and the same responsibilities that you have. So you need to set up a good foundation in order to be able to track against their spend and monitor their progress. The next slide really talks through some internal control best practices, if that's an unfamiliar word set to you. We just want to kind of give an idea and some examples of what some internal controls will be. The federal government is very, we'll call it attentive to how its money is spent, and these internal controls will really help show if there's an audit down the road, how you managed and how you maintained financial responsibility of the federal funds as you were doling them out and covering and building up the resiliency of your community. Shifting back into the interim report, kind of walking through what we learned from the guidance yesterday in the user guide. We do have some screenshots. They're a little blurry. We did link the user guide to the slides, so you can go ahead and click on that and see them and blow them up into a larger font. But really, the Treasury provided some screenshots, which is great. We haven't had a step-by-step process in some of our reporting portals before, but there is a portal that we'll be using to report on our projects and our expenditures, especially for this interim report. What we want to do is you'll double check that once you log in, once you apply, kind of get everyone set up with their user logins, you want to double check that the information is correct. You'll want to make sure your DUNS is correct. If you don't have a DUNS, they're free. You can apply for it from DNB. Make sure all of the contact information is set up. And then you want to, if there's any text box for errors, then that's going to go straight to Treasury so that you can go ahead and make those adjustments. They can make the adjustments on the back end as well. We try to provide kind of some tags like 1s and 2s to kind of really draw your eyes to where we thought some important pieces of information that you needed to double check before you kind of went through the entire reporting process. The next slide shows a very small snapshot of the expenditure categories. Like I said, you'll see there's 7 blue bars. Those are our 6 eligible expense categories, and then the 7th is admin. And then within that are all of our 66 subcategories. And that's going to be really where we're tracking the money to. There's going to be those 66 subcategory. You're going to want to track it to the cumulative obligations as well as the expenditure obligations in this interim report. So we're not reporting, we are tracking to the project level, but we're not reporting to the project level in this particular instance in this report. On the project and expenditure report, it will be the expenditures and the obligations by project, by Treasury category. That's not in the interim report. The interim report is a cumulative by the categories themselves. The next slide shows a screenshot of what you'll see when you go into the portal. You'll see these cumulative obligations, cumulative expenditures. If you zoom in, you'll see that that is for the 1-point number category. So it's going to be that first public health response. So if you've bought some vaccination kits, you're going to, if you've obligated $5,000 for vaccination kits, you'd put in the obligation in that first category. If you've spent any money on that obligation, you'll put that amount in. If not, you'll leave it as a 0. If you haven't spent anything, leave it blank. So you don't even have to enter zeros, you just leave it blank. Please don't use $signs, don't use commas, and use whole numbers. So we'll be talking through those in whole numbers as it goes. There are some auto-calculated fields that will show up at the bottom of the page. I would just double check those as you go through. If it's all zeros, hopefully it's a zero at the bottom. If you've added $5, $10, $20,000 anywhere, just make sure that that ties out to your records. We'd also recommend that you have a copy of the information and the data that you're inputting and use that as your backup record so that you have a way to validate against it. Just as a good start to the series of financial documents that we will be collecting as we go through this period of performance through 2026. There will be a section called recipient allocation. We all need to leave that blank. We're not the state of Illinois, and we're not passing any money to the non-entitlement units. We are the non-entitlement units or a direct recipient from the Treasury, so we just want to leave that blank. The next slide really shows kind of what that section looks like. We just went ahead and X'd it out. It's not applicable to us. You're going to see it 7.3 or 7.4, I'm sorry, and 7.5. That's going to be under the admin category. Again, that's not applicable to any of our metro cities or our non-entitlement units. It will say non-entitlement units, but that's the amount that the states and the tribal governments have transferred to non-entitlement units. So that was not, again, not applicable for our group. For those that intend or already have used some of the revenue replacement, if you sat through our webinars the last couple of weeks, you want to do the calculation, you're going to use that for general services, you do need to enter some of the information that we'll talk through. So base year revenue, your fiscal year end date, when does your actual fiscal year end, which growth adjustment you'll do, the 4.1% or your 3-year historical growth rate, whichever is the higher of the two values. You'll talk to your actual general revenue. So really giving the data points that we'll talk through tomorrow in the webinar you'll need to report these so that Treasury can validate your initial revenue replacement. There is a clause in the user guide that says if you misreport something in the interim report or in any of the reports going forward, you do have the opportunity to go back and fix it. So it's not a beholden to, it's just here's our first take. If you come back, presumably if you come back and you see that there's different revenue streams that could be included to up your number, or if it's, you're just happy with it, but you still want to tweak something, maybe you put in the wrong fiscal year end date, hope not, you do have the ability to change that at the next reporting cycle. But again, the interim report is a one-time report, so you want to update that in your project and expenditure report going forward. So the data points that we talk through tomorrow, including that explanation of how you'll be using that revenue loss, are all data points that will have to be entered into the interim report. The next slide really shows those data points and how we calculate them. Again, I won't spend a ton of time on that. We'll talk through that in greater detail tomorrow. But really just these are the steps that we go through to calculate it. It's also going to be the data points that we need to enter into the reporting itself and into the portal. One thing with the Treasury reports that we have had in the past is that there is an authorized representative for reporting, or the ARR. And that's going to be someone that certifies the report. Presumably, it's going to be a higher ranking official within your community, within your government. And it's really going to say, yes, this information is correct. Yes, I'm certifying this, that it's accurate, it's approved. Everybody knows this is what we're putting in. So you're going to need to designate that person when you set up your accounts. This person for the county side is the CFO. So really the reports will be generated. It will be passed through a number of review cycles and submitted, and then he will certify it before it goes to the Treasury. So this is kind of a final check to make sure that we have all of the information that is applicable, that it's accurate, just kind of that last set of double checking, that second set of eyes, or maybe fifth set of eyes or 10th set of eyes before we hit submit and this goes to the Treasury. Some of the questions that we've been receiving, we're an NEU, do we need to submit an interim report? No, you do not. And the interim report is only for metro cities, which are under 250,000 in population and have received an allocation of at least $5 million. And if you don't have any ARPA funds spent by July 31st, do we have to submit? Yes, you will leave everything blank. So you just won't have any expenditures, but if you are going to potentially use your revenue loss for any purpose, you will need to fill out those data points. So no expenditure obligation, you'll just leave those blank, but you will need to fill out that revenue loss calculation data point set. Lastly, a plug for our webinar tomorrow covering revenue loss. And then again, we have our office hours on Friday at 10 a.m. That's the time for you to ask any questions of us about anything ARPA related. We'll be on the call. As Michael said, please Please ask your questions. We're tweaking these webinars as guidance comes out for Treasury, as well as the questions that we're getting from you, just so that we can best update our information. We are making updates to the revenue loss calculation webinar, as well as developing a step-by-step, pretty easily transferable revenue loss tool. We'll probably, I think we're on track to showcase that. If not, we'll talk through it tomorrow at the webinar, but we'll probably send that out, or at least a link to it in our newsletter early next week or the week after. So it's just a real kind of easier calculator that you can put in your information, and it will give you those data points. Once you find them, it'll go ahead and put it in, and you can look through and see what your revenue loss number is. With that, you'll see it's our typical resources slide where we provide a bunch of links to a lot of different places to gather any additional information you may have, anything from the Treasury's website on the ARPA local fiscal recovery funds, the FAQs, which are frequently updated by the Treasury. And we did include the portal user guide, which is what we just walked through with the screenshots, and the State of Illinois non-entitlement unit webpage. If you are an NEU, that in non-entitlement unit, and you have not requested your money from the state, you have until September 30th at 5 p.m. This is your one and only shot to make that request. If September 30th comes and goes and you have not requested it, that money is going to be reallocated amongst those municipalities within the state. So hopefully, A, you've already requested it, and B, you know who's going to request it, and you have a plan to get that done before September 30th. So please be sure to pass that information on if you have not already requested or received your money from that. Lastly, we have the Cook County ARPA webpage, which is where we store all of these recordings or all of these decks as we go through them. And we also have a way to contact us. You can either email suburban COVID funding questions at cookcountyil.gov, our frequent flyer email that we used last summer. You can also scan the QR code, which is going to bring up a form that's going to be emailed directly to us to send in any additional questions. So with that, I will pause for any questions from the group. And if there's anything that you would like us to recover or revisit in terms of the webinar or the information presented here, I know we have a pretty light crowd, so maybe there's going to be a ton of questions, so we are ready. So please feel free to either ask your question out loud, type it into the chat. We're here to answer them for the next 34 minutes as needed. We'll give it one final call if there are any questions from anyone. Otherwise, we will be available through email. If you have our contact information, you're welcome to email us or call us as needed. We're here to answer your questions. Again, if you are a non-entitlement unit, you don't have an interim report due, but you do need to request your money from the state by September 30th, please. All right, there are no other questions, comments, concerns, jokes, dreams, hopes, fears. We're going to go ahead and call it for today, and we'll see everyone tomorrow on the webinar for the revenue loss.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Natalie.